Rejection sucks. It almost doesn't matter who you are, how secure you are in yourself. If you're rejected, it blows. Now imagine that you are rejected harshly by your husband on the world stage. And then imagine, on top of that, that one of your 3 dead predecessors was possibly set up and executed during her rejection by that same husband. How would you handle that? How would you emotionally and psychologically cope with that? While all eyes are on you and the fate of a powerful religious and political alliance, as well as possibly your own life, rely on you playing these cards perfectly and in the absolute right way. While you're emotionally contending with the rejection that you've been given, you also have to act correct. Even though the person rejecting you is possibly retroactively diagnosed as a malignant narcissist, possible psychopath at certain points in his life who is wildly insecure and notoriously and famously unhinged even in his own time. And yet, that was the reality of Henry VIII's 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. So, starts yet another episode of Crown Gilded and Screwed. My name is Cara May Adamo. I am your host. If you are new here, welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us. Basically, the format of the show is we take a royal, or as I like to call royal adjacent person, somebody who is either born with a silver spoon in their mouth or early on in their life achieves some level of dynastic style privilege to where they might as well be royal, gold gilded, if you will. And that person lives, by all accounts, a fairly lucky life. They have everything kind of at their fingertips. The world is their oyster, and yet somehow that silver spoon tarnishes. And they are either notoriously unlucky or crazy ass chaos ensues and their life takes a hit. Whatever it is, those are the people that we like to kind of take a look at, do a deep dive on, sometimes with a little bit of an empathetic gaze when we can, while always trying to hold people accountable for their actions. So yeah, that's the show. Let's dive in. The year is 1515. Portugal has established their sugar colony in Bahia. Cardinal Wolsey was appointed as Lord Chancellor to Henry VIII. Louis XII died, giving France over to his son-in-law Francois. And at Swan Castle in Dusseldorf, Duchess Maria of Ulickburg is giving birth to her 2nd child. This one is a baby girl who she names Anna van der Mark. Now, Maria and her husband Johann, or as he's sometimes referred to in history, John III, we're going to call him Johann just to differentiate, they were married in 1509, but despite the fact that they were married with young kids, they actually lived relatively separate existences for the first about 15 years of their life. And the reason for this is not necessarily marital woes so much as it is, well, work. You see, in Germany, the way that power was divided up was a little bit different than it was for perhaps their English neighbors, right? So in Germany, a duke and duchess could have their own principalities. Regardless of gender, they would rule over said principalities. Because in the 1500s in Europe, I'll repeat that, in the 1500s in Europe, they believed that women could be in power and run countries and city-states. Isn't that wild? How women could be in power and left to govern? They somehow made it work. So Maria was in charge of the Ulickburg Principality. So she actually lived with her children in Berg Castle. Whereas Johann, he was actually in charge more of the dukedom in Cleves. So you have 2 different principalities. They have married, but they haven't necessarily combined their governing bodies yet. For the most part, they live and command their own thing, and they just kind of have like a long distance relationship. If you look back into the lineage of this family, they do have quite a bit of royal street cred. Anne's father can trace his lineage all the way back to Edward I and his wife Eleanor of Castile. And then Maria herself is like from a long line of German princesses, dating all the way back to Sibylla, who is actually who she named her first daughter after, Sophia of Saxony and Adelaide of Teck. And so you have quite a bit of family history and royal history that is baked into the Duke and Duchess of basically collectively Ulickburg and Cleves. As far as Cleves is concerned, they actually had counts all the way dating back to the 11th century. There is a little bit of a legend in Anne of Cleves' family history that says that a knight appeared to the heroes of Cleves, and he was on a boat that was guided by swans. So the imagery of swans is very important in this family. That's why the castle that she's born at is named Swan Castle. Basically, by the 15th century, they're all officially established as dukes, and the ruling family is Mark, which is Anne's family. So you have Maria of Ulickburg, and then you have the Mark family headed by Johann of Cleves. Now, there are a couple of things that have been said about Anne over the years, including in her own time, thanks to her lovely, charming husband and his rhetoric, that have disparaged Anne in a number of ways. One of the things that I want to tackle right now is that Anne was sort of viewed as this uneducated woman, maybe compared to Catherine of Aragon or perhaps Anne Boleyn, who were inarguably in their own times two of the most interesting, intellectual, educated women probably in all of Europe. Yeah, I guess when you compare those subject matters, it does make sense that she didn't perhaps seem as worldly, certainly as Anne Boleyn. But I would not necessarily say that it's fair to assume that Anne of Cleves was uneducated. My summation is she was probably educated quite a bit, just not necessarily in the ways that noble women were generally educated in perhaps France, Spain, or England. Now, what do I mean by that? It used to be joked that she wasn't educated beyond the ability to do needlepoint. And yeah, she could read and write in German, but she couldn't read and write in any other languages. And that's a fairly reductive summation of her education. And it's probably, honestly, mostly a patriarchal leaning, sort of a slight at best. And probably done as a result of Henry VIII's reaction to a couple of things that happen later on when they get together. Remember that Anne comes from this very long line of these powerful political women. And she would have likely been expected to exercise some level of power at some point in her life, or at least to be able to manage a large household estate or castle, right? Because that's what they all did in her family. So if her mother is an active, politically inclined duchess, would she not have raised her daughters to be able to perform those duties, since that would be the expectation? In all likelihood, her education would have included things more like regional property law or taxation law. She probably would have known how to manage finances for a large scale household. She probably would have learned diplomacy and arbitration to a certain extent. More or less, women of her caliber in Germany were taught to run big estates, or at least their own households, and they would have known things about farming and livestock. It would have been more of a perhaps masculine leaning for the time period education, but it was an education, and it was a very practical one. Noble women contributed equally in their households in Germany, and more importantly than anything, they were recognized and respected for it. So yeah, Anne of Cleves, in addition to all the things I just mentioned, also learned to cook and to sew and to make clothing. So yeah, she did needlepoint, but she didn't just do needlepoint. She knew how to fucking run shit. People misunderstand that women running these households all the way up until about the 19th century were essentially business people. And in Germany, for these large estate homes, some of these women would make more money off of their half of the shit than their husbands did. And that's kind of the beauty of having sort of a more equal playing field where women can hold power and women can run estates. So that's the world that Anne would have been brought into, and that is likely the kind of education she would have gotten. What she was lacking in her education were things like history or languages or singing or musical instruments. She notoriously didn't play anything, which was shocking to England because everybody apparently did. She wouldn't have necessarily been fine-tuned in her rhetoric, but she would have understood how to read people and how to reach agreements with people. Because again, diplomacy would have been key in an environment where she possibly could have held political office in the 1500s. So where would Anne have been in terms of religion? Well, we do still have a decent amount of papal control throughout Europe, okay? But at this point, you have a certain Protestant edge that's starting to creep in. And there was a decent amount of religious diversity in Germany during the time that Anne would have been brought up. And that diversity also extends into her own family as well. So first and foremost, her mom was strictly speaking a Roman Catholic. She was very devout. She never veered away from Roman Catholicism, and that was incredibly important to her. So Anne would have been raised more than likely with the Roman Catholic Church at least taking precedent. Her dad likewise was also a Roman Catholic, but despite his religious leanings, he had friends of other faiths, including Erasmus, who was kind of like the philosophy it boy of the time. And he was very in vogue, and people throughout the German court and also in the English court, they all kind of were interested or at least talking about Erasmus. So you have the dad who is Roman Catholic, but he's friends with Erasmus. And he does, despite being Roman Catholic, as a result of this friendship, he has Lutheran sympathies. He's not like a Lutheran, of course, but he does have sympathies, and he's not necessarily fire and brimstone Catholicism all the way. So those are the parents. And now what happens when a relatively open-minded person and a very traditional person get married and start raising kids together? Well, discord. The oldest sister, Sibylla, was actually married to her husband, John Frederick, when she was about 15 years old. And John Frederick, and as a result, her, they both were friends with Martin Luther himself. So they were buddies with him, and they were Lutheran, Protestant, and very, very extreme Protestantism. So that's Sibylla. Then we have Anne herself, and Anne throughout her life actually flips back and forth between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Whether or not she does that truly like on the inside is kind of between her and like the universe, but she does seem to push her loyalties strategically throughout her life. So she switches back and forth officially on paper. So that's where Anne is. So she's raised by her parents, which are Roman Catholic, but her sister, her closest sister that she writes letters to her whole life, her sister is radically Protestant and is actually friends with Martin Luther himself. Then you have her two younger siblings. We have Wilhelm and we have Amalia. And these two they're like almost Irish twins. They're so close in age. Amalia is very Protestant, just like Sibylla is. And Wilhelm is friends with Sibylla's husband, his brother-in-law, John Frederick, who, remember, is close friends with Martin Luther. So like Wilhelm is friends with these guys personally. But despite that, he himself is Catholic like his parents are. You would think that like, given the fact that he's friends with these Protestant people, that he would be really chill with the fact that Amalia, his sister, was Protestant, but apparently he really, really fucking wasn't. I don't know why it was a double standard, but it absolutely was. So Amalia never gets married. She did the like childless cat lady life. And she becomes the fun auntie for Sibylla's kids and like raises them basically as like a nanny, essentially. And since their parents and Amalia herself are all Protestant, she's obviously raising them to be Protestant. And Wilhelm finds out about this, about kids that are not his children, whose parents, Sibylla and John Frederick, are Protestants. He finds this out about them, the Protestant family's kids. And he gets so pissed at Amalia that he fucking attacks her and runs around the house with a hatchet chasing after her because he gets so mad at her. And a servant had to step in and basically like slam the door in his face. So Wilhelm has a little bit of a temper, and he's kind of a hard nut to crack because like, again, he's Catholic, but he's friends with people that are not Catholic, but not everybody can be Protestant. And also, despite being Catholic, Wilhelm and their dad, like his father, Johann, or John III, they like have beef with the Roman emperor over land disputes. Like they have like some private beef with this guy. So even though they're really, really Catholic, they also like go out of their way to undermine the Catholic Church all the time. And yet he'll chase his sister around with a fucking hatchet because she taught children that aren't his about Protestantism. I don't know. Wilhelm had a lot of mental gymnastics about his decision-making throughout his life. But anyway, that's Anne of Cleves' like brother, and the rest of them are all, you know, basically everybody's all over the place in terms of religious fluidity, we could say, which is, I think, mostly what you could kind of say of what Anne was. She was very religiously fluid. In 1527, we have Anne herself getting engaged. Now, Anne at this point is only 11 years old, although the age of consent is 10 in Europe at the time, believe it or not. She is engaged to Francis, Duke of Bar, who is actually the heir of Lorraine. The problem is Francis was only 9 years old, so he was actually younger than the age of consent. So this was like an unofficial engagement. It was taken as seriously as it was legally allowed to be taken, but because he was not considered of legal age, it was more of just like a little bookmark. They put a pin in it and they were like, we'll get to that later. But essentially, she's expected to be engaged to this guy. 1530 rolls around and two important things happen. Number one is that Duke Johann, which is, remember, their father, Duke Johann proposes to Henry VIII that his daughter Mary get married to Johann's son Willem. So Anne of Cleves, her brother, was supposed to marry Henry VIII's daughter Mary. Because remember, Henry VIII is in his 40s at this point. He is significantly older than Anne. He's actually the exact age of Anne's mother. So there is a huge age gap, which means his child could feasibly marry her brother. The other thing that happens in 1530 is John Frederick establishes, and it becomes the head of, the League of All Protestant Princes and Free States. So now there's a League of European Princes and Free States that are all Protestant, and Anne's brother-in-law is the head of this. 1533 is also a key time period. So by this time, Henry VIII has met, love-bombed, and fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, and he decides that he wants to get a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. The Pope would be required to say yes to this divorce, but he wasn't inclined to do so because, you know, there was no reason for it. Henry VIII comes up with about a million different reasons for why this is justified. We will get into that during the episode on Catherine. Just know that at this point, he has fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, and he's decided that he's so gung-ho for this girl that he's willing to break from the Catholic Church, causing a giant rift in already kind of religiously unsteady England and Europe at this point. He decides it is so prudent that he marry the love of his life, his flavor of the week, essentially, Anne Boleyn, that he breaks with the Catholic Church. This is really fucking stupid because the Holy Roman Emperor at the time is actually Catherine of Aragon's, like, nephew, Charles V. So not only is he kicking dust at the Catholic Church themselves, he's also insulting Charles V's auntie. So Henry had some balls, and I think you'll find that throughout all of our stories about Henry. 1535 rolls around, and Anne's betrothal to Francis of Duke of Bar is dissolved. It was never really getting off the ground anyway. Like I said before, he was too young to give consent, so they never actually solidified the deal. Never goes through. Diplomatically, just no longer makes sense for them to do this. She is now a single woman, but actually she's kind of fine with it. Anybody who was around her at the time took note of the fact that she didn't seem particularly upset. She just kind of liked life the way that it was. And that was living at her mom's, estate, helping run the household. She knew the servants, personally, because it was more of a hands-on aristocracy where, they would get in and clean and run things really well with all the servants as, kind of almost as equals in a certain way. Not quite as equals, but, she worked too. So there was just sort of a, we were in the trenches kind of a mentality. She's very attached to all these people. So she's not upset that her life's not getting uprooted, kind of passive about it. Then in 1536, Henry VIII has changed his mind, which is very on brand for him. And he has his beloved Anne Boleyn that he wrecked a fucking country over and dissolved his marriage. He decides he's kind of done with her It's not as simple as that. There are a couple of other very complicated things that went into it, but essentially, like, Anne Boleyn is tried for treason, which she was almost certainly innocent of, and she is beheaded, and conveniently, she is not even cold and in the dirt before Henry moves on to his next choice, which is Jane Seymour. Whether or not he already had Jane Seymour on a leash a little bit during his marriage to Anne is up for debate. I think there was probably a little bit of a gray area there, although I can't really prove it. Either way, Henry kind of proves the whispers right. He ends up marrying Jane Seymour that exact year. And then in 1537, he is rewarded for this with what he has always wanted, which is a legitimate son and heir to the throne. Jane Seymour gives birth to Edward VI. Unfortunately, she dies giving him the thing he's always wanted, and he is a widower again. It needs to be noted at this point, this is his only legitimate son, although he does have two legitimate daughters. Well, he has two daughters and their legitimacy is questioned on and off throughout their lives because of his many divorces and just sort of redos, I guess, that he would do. But he has two daughters who have a claim to the throne, and he has a legitimate son. But at this point, he's like, it's not enough. He wants more male spares. It also needs to be noted, he did have one son out of wedlock named Henry Fitzroy, and he actually acknowledged him publicly and considered him legitimate as much as he was allowed to. He just wasn't legally allowed to give his kingdom over to Fitzroy. Had he been able to, you could argue the Anne Boleyn bullshit would have never even happened. But here we are. So now Jane Seymour has died, giving birth to Edward VI. Henry is now single again. And he needs a couple of things. Number one, he needs a political alliance, like something fierce, because he doesn't have a lot of friends, because he's not very good at keeping them alive. And he also kind of needs a distraction. He's in mourning. He's very distraught over Jane Seymour. She was allegedly the one that he loved the most because they were still in love when she died. I would argue, given the way that Henry often is in his relationships, I think she died before he could get sick of her, personally. And so she was still like, I don't know, they were still in the honeymoon phase of things, which seemed to be when Henry was the most reliably in love. He would tire of women fairly quickly after a while, and so you could argue it could have gone either way for her had she lived. Unfortunately, she died far too young for any of us to ever know. So now Henry's in mourning, but he does need a distraction. He likes women, he likes spending time with women, and he loves the chase. The clock's kind of ticking in his mind. And also on top of that, like, just the court needed a queen. And the reason for that is that the way that the economics of the court were set up, a lot of these women in the absence of a queen were not really given employment. So for employment reasons alone, it was a big deal to have like a queen and have her ladies and have all of her servants and her version of the house. That was needed in order to keep up, you know, people's livelihood. Basically, that's where we're at. Henry's single and ready to mingle. Jane Seymour has passed away, Anne Boleyn is beheaded, and now he needs to find himself another bride. So, in the meantime, France and Spain are at each other's throats. Now, they've been embroiled in a series of battles known to history as the Italian Wars, and this works pretty well for Henry because it means the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, has a lot on his plate. Unfortunately for Henry, they end up signing a 10-year truce with one another, which means Charles, who hates Henry, now has nothing but time. And he also currently has control over the Pope. So back in 1535, something else went down, and that is the Bull of Excommunication. The word bull comes from bulla, which is B-U-L-L-A. It comes from like the seal, like the seal that they would use for like important letters. That's what that's from. The Bull of Excommunication basically worked as essentially a counter manifesto to Martin Luther's 1521 thesis. So the reason this is important is it was pitched against Henry for causing his bullshit in 1533. What it's meant to do is further alienate Henry and his followers, essentially, from the Catholic Church, make it to where he cannot have sacraments with fellow Catholics. It creates a divide, which for Henry probably personally didn't matter that much because he already considered himself the head of his own church, so he didn't really care anymore. But it does make things very, very complicated for Catholics and Protestants to live together. Now, this becomes gradually more and more dire as the years progress. even after Anne Boleyn is beheaded like a year after this bull of excommunication is even sent out, the ripple effects of her marriage to Henry continue on. In 1538, another thing happens is a double marriage is proposed between Willem and Mary, Henry VIII's daughter again. Only this time, I guess Johann sweetened the deal and was like, hey, like, I've got some chicks of repute. You're looking for a chick. How about I hook you up, buddy? Let's do a double marriage kind of a deal. It was floated. Henry VIII didn't seem to like fully embrace the idea because nothing ever comes of it, but it was considered, and that certainly put like House of Cleves on the map a little bit more for these purposes. And then in 1539, Johann dies. When Johann dies, Willem steps in, and now he has control, he himself, over all of his parents' estates. So it's a huge region that he has control over, and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is pissed about this. Just ruffles his feathers even more. In 1539, Anne now suddenly is of age, and Henry's looking for a wife. So she suddenly becomes hot. And by that I mean all of the sudden people are talking about her, and they are talking about how beautiful she is and how smart she is and how much of a wonderful countenance she has and how she would be such a good choice for the king and how compatible they would be. And most of it's bullshit. But what it is it's propaganda, and it's starting to work because, again, Henry needs a girl. Henry always needs a girl. And they need to make a political alliance with a country that's at least willing to work with them, because France and Spain are getting along all of a sudden, and that doesn't really ever bode well for Henry. He needs to strengthen the alliances he can scrounge up. So suddenly Anne is now an it girl. She went from being just some duchess out in Germany, possibly going to marry a duke and then, inherit Lorraine through that. And that would be her life. And now all of a sudden that's scrapped, and she is possibly going to be the Queen of England. That's how fast this happens. So this reputation of hers for being like the perfect choice weasels its way in to Thomas Cromwell's ear. Thomas Cromwell is one of Henry VIII's besties. So now let's take a look at the women that Henry was considering after Jane Seymour unfortunately passed away. So number one, Henry was interested in two very particular women prior to really giving any consideration to Anne of Cleves. First one was Christina of Milan, which that one kind of gives me the ick because she was 16, and at this point Henry was in his late 40s, which honestly for their time period meant that he could have been her grandfather, but I digress. Christina, with her dimples and her liveliness and her beauty, was considered a fairly decent option. Henry was particularly interested in her. Christina allegedly went on to say that if she had two necks, the King of England could have one of them. Obviously, it was a slight about Anne Boleyn. I will say that there's a little bit of debate about whether or not she actually said that. It's giving let them eat cake from Marie Antoinette. We don't actually know for sure that she said it, but the rumor was there, and it's always possible that she did. No one could really blame her if she had. So that's Christina. She wasn't super enthused. She ends up marrying somebody else, and it ends up okay. She would have married him had she been told to, but it looks like the powers that be in her life were like, let's not do that. The other one was Marie de Guise. Now, Marie was a cousin to the King of France. She was a widow. She had already given birth to one son successfully, and this is key, she was voluptuous. And by this time, Henry had put on some weight himself. He would note himself that he was a very big guy now, and he felt that because he was a big man, he needed a big woman. So he went from being a very athletic person who was always looking for like the more slender, athletic looking women. Now he wanted somebody kind of more his size, apparently. And he was particularly enraptured with the idea of Marie de Guise. Marie de Guise was actually at this point already betrothed to his nephew, which was James V of Scotland. And Henry was salty about it. And he said that he couldn't understand how she would prefer the beggarly and stupid King of Scots. Again, he's talking about his nephew. He couldn't understand how she would ever want that. Nonetheless, the Scots they wasted no time. She ships off and marries James V pretty fast. So Henry misses out on Marie de Guise, which seems to be the one that he was the most interested in, like out of the two. So now that leaves Christina and Marie are out of the question. Now he's looking and listening to Cromwell, who has been whispering in his ear about Anne of Cleves and her sister Amalia, because both of them are still single. They are both a very powerful German alliance. And so this looks very good, on paper. So there was a tradition in courtly love, you could say, where basically, because you wouldn't meet somebody right away, they would provide a portrait of that person to let you know what they looked like, right? Like a send pics kind of a deal. The issue with that, though, is if it was a particularly favorable alliance to the other party, it was always possible that they could have kind of like lied via painting and basically catfished. So Henry, at this point, used to being attracted to his wives. He was attracted to Catherine of Aragon just because they were friends first and actually fell for each other along the line. And she was very beautiful when she was younger, so he was attracted to her. He was very attracted and almost obsessive about Anne Boleyn. He was attracted to Jane. He now wants to have that rush, that he doesn't just view marriage as this broker deal. He wants to have, his cake and eat it too. He wants kind of a more modern marriage where you're attracted to the person that you're going to share a life with and build with. So that's what he's kind of expecting. He's not expecting to just take anybody. So he has a special painter that he happens to really love, and this is Hans Holbein. Now, Holbein was an incredibly talented portrait artist. He painted pretty much everybody at court that, could afford it. The Holbein portraits are still around to this day. You can see them at a variety of museums, and sometimes they go up for auction as well. Anne of Cleves' portrait has been hotly sought after and is now currently in a museum. But Holbein basically goes over to Germany knowing full well that the German duchies are going to commission a painting themselves. He goes without telling them. He kind of does a little sneak attack, and he quickly paints these girls as accurately, quote unquote, as possible. Although I will say, if you look at Holbein's work, they've been analyzed, and he might change a nose a little bit, and he might make adjustments that perhaps do look a little bit more favorable. Think of it as like a filter that he would put on them. So for all of Henry's trust in Holbein, he mostly did the right thing, but he also had a lot of pressure. And the whole reason for him going out there was to secure a bride, essentially. So Holbein would take some creative liberties, but for the most part, he was pretty accurate. And he would also paint live. He would paint really fast. So Holbein sneaks in, paints the girls. They know about it at that point. And, they say that he can. And they actually chase down the other painter and intercept his painting so that Henry never sees it. And Holbein's paintings are the ones that Henry sees first and foremost. And the thing about that is Henry falls in love with the Holbein portraits. Henry also had a habit of building stuff up in his mind and having a whole fantasy up here and putting people on pedestals and all of that stuff. In a lot of ways, he was this insane romantic schmuck who just lived in this fantasy world about 70% of the time. And in that fantasy world, everything that he's dreaming of is going to be exactly how it works out. And of course it never is, because Henry's in love inevitably with both the chase and with the fantasy. He's never actually in love with the person. And we've all fallen victim to that, especially when you're younger, you kind of fall victim to that because you fall in love with the potential of a person or the idea of a person. Having a crush is the idea of a person. It's not really knowing them and knowing what it is to be in love with them. Henry was in love with the idea of being in love, and he was in love with his own imagination because he has this idea in his brain that Anne is just it for him. Based on a portrait, Holbein had to fight for that portrait because initially the women were in this German dress with the German headpieces, and they were kind of their faces were obscured a little bit. And Holbein actually asked, like, can I see their face? I can't even see them. How do I paint them this way? And Willem was like, would you rather see them naked? What are you talking about? Because like, that's how different they were in terms of like dress code. So Holbein fights like hell to even get this damn portrait, and now Henry's enamored with the portrait. And the portrait becomes just like this fixated thing in his mind, because he already lost out on Christina, he already lost out on Marie de Guise, he lost Jane to natural causes, so now he's putting all of this misplaced love and misplaced need, because he was a very needy person, and all of these hopes and desires and wishes and dreams for the future of his kingdom and his family and himself, he puts all of this into this fucking portrait. None of this is based on Anne herself. It's not based on her in real life. It's not based on her personality. It's not based on jokes she said. This is all based on shit that he imagined based on someone's drawing of a girl. And he builds it up more and more and more. So all of the disappointments that he's been suffering, mostly his own doing, let's just say, but all of these disappointments that he's been dealing with, he's viewing this portrait and this mystery fantasy girl behind this portrait as kind of his saving grace and kind of his prize at the end of this tunnel that he's been in. And that is really unfortunate, because there's no way for anybody to live up to the standards of a fantasy that someone else has of them. And that, I believe, is the beginning. While yes, it's the upswing, it is the beginning of what happens with Anne and Henry. So Henry VIII is so enamored with the idea of this woman he's never met that he actually goes so far as to waive her dowry. Like, he wants nothing out of it. He just wants her. Again, based on absolutely zero communication. This is just on a hunch and on listening to all of his buddies who have clearly never led him astray. So not only does he waive the dowry, he actually offers to pay Willem 100,000 florins. 100,000 florins, I was able to convert that to about 18 million pounds in 2017. And then from that, I was able to use the currency converter to then find out how much that would be in American money in 2024. Right now, roughly, that stands at about 29.51 million American dollars in 2024. That's the type of money that he paid Willem in exchange for the right to marry Willem's sister. That is not a small amount of money to essentially buy a bride. There's something a little mail order about it, but I'm just gonna leave that alone because the times were the times. But anyway, so he pays for his own bride based on a portrait that he had painted multiple times, actually. And then it ends up working out. Willem's like, yeah, I'll take that and prestige. Are you fucking kidding me? I gotta marry her off anyway. So Willem says yes. And in October 4th of 1539, they do sign the marriage treaty. And then in December of 1539, Anne makes her way over to England. And there's a lot of question about what routes she should take and whether or not there should be a sea, like a ship, and she should do this crazy arduous journey via sea to go find Henry and be with him. Again, this is all Henry's idea. It wasn't the safest route. Henry pitches this and even has a bunch of his cartographers chart out exactly this cool route that he thinks she should take. And all of this is based on Henry's assumption about himself that is not founded, that he must be this adventurer deep down in his bones. He believes that he's an adventurer, even though he is rapidly aging, rapidly letting himself go, has no athleticism anymore because of an injury he sustained early on. He is literally just essentially sitting on the couch pretending he could be this incredible adventurous pirate, I guess. And so he transfers that onto this fantasy girl who has at no point insinuated that that's the kind of life she wants to lead, but he has built this fantasy in his head. So Henry has them create this whole model of this journey that she's gonna take to get to him, and she's gonna sneak out without Charles V having any idea and all of that stuff. And he just has this idea that he's really gonna stick it to him, and his wife's gonna show up and everything's gonna be great, right? And none of that works because Charles V was like, nah, honestly, I don't care that much. It's fine. And like lets her pass the normal way through like the land so that she's not, you know, in danger. And Henry VIII is like a little diffused by this because he's like, oh, well, but this way was cooler. It was such a cool story I told myself in my head for no reason. So Henry was like a little let down by the fact that she had safe passage instead of this like really complicated dramatic journey. Honestly, he was bored. Like he needed more hobbies. That's really what it comes down to. I believe that Henry went crazier and crazier after he had his accident. For those who don't know, while Henry was married to Anne Boleyn, he ends up having an accident. His horse is fully armored and falls on him and he shatters his leg. And bone fragments are in there and it festers and it becomes an ulcer and it's real gross. And according to like reports of the time, it also smelled sometimes. And he went from being this really athletic guy with like, you know, a lot of energy and always hunting and always jousting and things like that. He goes from that to being like sedentary, overweight, not because of a life choice, just like because he had an injury and couldn't heal from it properly. So now like he's all of the shit he likes to do, he can't do anymore. And he's just sitting there with his thoughts. And so what he's doing instead is just creating a fantasy in his brain about how this marriage is going to happen, what this girl's going to be like, the bravery she's going to show sneaking out, you know, in the middle of the night and being on this ship and all of this nonsense, total nonsense that no one even suggests is necessary. It's just something he built into his brain. And then everybody's like, no, we're not doing, like, that's cute. We're not doing that though. Like she's just going to go the normal way and you're going to shut up. That is what ends up happening. So Anne doesn't go the crazy route that Henry literally commissions models for. She goes the normal route. It does involve a boat, but it's not like the whole time. While she's on the boat, she actually already, her diplomacy like brain is kicking in and she wants him to like her. So since she doesn't know much about the stuff that everybody in England knows about, like the rhetoric and the philosophy and all of the romanticism, because she doesn't know any of that, what she does think about is like, what does everybody generally do? Well, they all play cards. So she actually was on the boat, like learning to play all of Henry's favorite card games so that they would have something to do together because she didn't really speak English very well. She didn't know how to read or write in English and she wanted something. So she learns to play all of his favorite card games. And Henry actually really liked card games. That was actually a thing that would make him fall for somebody, was their ability to play like a really witty, interesting game of cards. So January 1st, the new year, 1540, she is now coming in from Dover and she stops in at Rochester Abbey. She is supposed to meet Henry for the first time on January 3rd, 2 days later. But Henry is bored. And so what Henry does is he gets it into his brain, and in this case, it's like a tradition of courtly love, apparently, but like only where he lives. Like this would not have been something that she would have been familiar with, just so we're clear, because you know, it's always about Henry, it's never about her. He gets it into his brain that if his true love is really Anne of Cleves, if his wife is really his true love, which she must be by now because he's infatuated based on nothing, so she must be. If she's really his true love, then she should be able to recognize him no matter what. Because Henry lives in the real world, where the rest of us live, and that's normal. So Henry shows up to Rochester Abbey cosplaying as a knight. He dresses as a full-on knight, like a little boy playing dress-up. And he barges into her bedroom at Rochester Abbey. This woman who is thinking of herself as already basically married. She's a virgin. She's very conservative. Remember, they had like hoods over their faces. Like this is not a girl who, she was a modest person. That's just how she was raised to be. And he fucking barges into her bedroom dressed as a knight, just a weird, no offense to other body types, but just a weird, not in shape knight, just some weirdo, barges in and kisses her. First of all, probably her first kiss, which is less than an ideal way to do it. even if it wasn't her first kiss, what the actual, like he Me Too'd her. Like what the fuck is that? He just barges in and kisses her and she's like, what? Like she's not like mean about it because she's probably terrified because he's a knight now. It's just some random rogue fucking knight that like sizes her by a lot. She's just like looking out the window wistfully thinking, okay, when the fuck is somebody getting this weirdo out of my room? What is he gonna do to me? Why is he in my bedroom dressed as a knight? Like, what is going on? Why did nobody stop him? Like, she's probably on a whole other level right now. She's thinking about what is he capable of? Who is this person? Why is he here? Why did he kiss me? Does he want more from me? Like, she's in like shut down, wistfully look out the window, don't think about it. I will say he does give her a gift on behalf of the king, in quotes, which she accepted, but she was like, but you kissed me. What? But you still kissed me. That means nothing. Like, what did you do? So then Henry is like deflated because his master plan of, again, cosplaying as a knight and randomly kissing this girl who's never met him before, who is supposed to be loyal to her husband, who is him. Like, in her mind, she's being loyal to her husband. He takes it as an insult that she didn't recognize him as a knight and gets butthurt about it, goes into the other room, changes into his long purple flowing robes and comes out to show himself to her. At that point, she's like, Henry? This is how we're doing this? Okay, I didn't know. I'm sorry. Like, she's apologetic, because like, what the fuck else is she gonna do at this point? She's way far away from home. She can't go back. She's in it now. Gotta make this guy happy. He's clearly a lunatic, and which is what she was afraid of in the first place, probably. So she basically, like, kisses his ring, essentially, kisses his ass, and tries to make amends, apologizes for not understanding the situation right away, takes it on as if it's her fucking fault that he did this dumb shit. They make amends. He forgives her. He gaslit her. I can't. So he forgives her for not understanding his weird goddamn game that no one would understand. How are you gonna show up in a costume? Then January 3rd rolls around, which is like when they're actually supposed to meet, and they meet officially, in quotes, at Blackheath. And 3 days later, on January 6th, they are married in Greenwich, London. I would say a big part of why they got married is both of them are like already in it, and money's already been exchanged, she's already here, marriage treaty was already signed. They needed this treaty, but at this point, Henry is so upset that the following starts to happen. First off, Henry assumes immediately that she must not be the love of his life, and something was clearly wrong. Something was wrong. He was wrong. He was acting insane. Henry was all about like bad omens and bad signs, meaning that something was destined to fail or whatever. We'll get into that whole thing later in another episode, but know that was baked into who he was as a person. He kind of got it from his mom. It was a whole thing. But once Henry would get it into his head that something was not meant to be, that was in his brain. By this time, they'd already paid for everything, already signed everything, went forward with the marriage anyway, and he proceeds to go to bed with her and not fuck her at all. At all. The next morning when Thomas Cromwell's like, hey, so how was she? Like, everything cool? Like, being a dick and wanting to talk like men. And Henry informs Cromwell that he dislikes her more now than he did the day before. And he starts to tell everybody that the reason that she's still a virgin is he is so repulsed by her face. He's so put off by how ugly and unseemly she is. This woman whose portrait he's been fanboying over for fucking ever, by the way. He's so put off by her and so just disgusted and repulsed by her that he can't even do it. Henry, who is a man whore 1,000 times over. He even goes so far. So part of the reason he probably couldn't get it up was because, like, he was in his like mid to late 40s. He's like 48 at this point. And frankly, not in the best health anymore. And, you know, when you're not in the best health and you're recovering from an injury and you've been depressed and mourning and all of that stuff, your sex drive's gonna go down. Your libido drops a little bit, you know, like we've all been there. We'll be there again. It happens. But Henry, like, has to be infallible, you know, in his brain. So he makes sure that the doctor announces to everybody that he has not one, but 2 nocturnal emissions every night. So now he's going around saying that she's ugly and that he gets 2 wet dreams a night in his 40s. And that's his save for the fact that he didn't have sex with her on their wedding night. He proceeds to not have sex with her for 6 months. Basically, throughout their entire marriage, what essentially goes down is they would go to bed, he'd kiss her on the forehead, say goodnight, sweetheart, and then he'd just do nothing with her. Whether or not Anne was actually repulsive to him, personally, I think it was a combination of a few things. I think that Henry built a lot of things up in his head, like I've very clearly said before. I also think that he was a little bit insulted about the fact that she didn't understand his weird game that he was trying to play and recognized him immediately through knight's armor. And I think he also was just not really in it. I don't know. There's an argument to be made that Henry wasn't ready to move on yet. I don't want to forgive a lot of the stupid shit that he does, but when it comes to Anne of Cleves, he really doesn't ultimately seem to even blame her that much deep down. Like, I think he even knew that this wasn't on her. And the reason I feel that way is that things go so different for her than they do for any of his other wives. So June 24th of 1540, so this is now a little over 6 months into their marriage, Anne is actually formally asked to leave court. She is blindsided by this a little bit, only because like they hadn't been fighting and nothing had really happened and they hadn't even had sex yet. So she was just, she was kind of like sitting there going, what happened? Like what went on here? I don't understand, you know, because he didn't really have like a concrete issue with her other than telling everybody she was ugly, but yet he wouldn't like go forward with their relationship. It might not have been like a complete shock to her, but she definitely didn't realize he was like not even gonna try, or at least she was holding out hope for a little bit. She did break down and cry on July 6th of 1540. She was told that he was going to annul the marriage, probably out of fear and out of feeling like a failure, since that was what she was raised to believe she should be doing, as being like a positive wife for somebody. And she, again, didn't seem to do anything wrong. She just felt like a failure and she felt like it was completely out of her control. But she wises up, she gets her shit together. She reacts emotionally for a second in private, but then she gets to work. And what she does is she handles Henry better than anybody else ever did. July 12th of 1540, the marriage is formally annulled. And in that annulment, she secures a monster settlement and lands and castles, including Anne Boleyn's childhood home of Hever Castle. She is given titles, she's given everything. And it was essentially done as like a thank you to her for not causing a big, huge ordeal. Henry really didn't want a situation like Anne Boleyn. There was no real reason for it. Not that that was justified either. It wasn't death like it was with Jane Seymour. And in Catherine's case, Catherine, like, she held on to the bitter end. Catherine fought for her man. She fought to keep her marriage. She continued to sew his shirts until the bitter end. Like, she refused to acknowledge that she was no longer Henry's wife. Anne of Cleves was never really Henry's wife. They just kind of knew each other. And I think because she never really caused a problem, she never talked shit about him, she never complained about him, she kind of handled him diplomatically, like maybe she would have been taught to in Germany. Just saying. Uneducated Anne, in quotes. And she comes out of it one of the richest women in England. She is also, from then on out, referred to as the king's sister, or beloved sister. They never fucked, so I guess that counts. And they become really good friends. So much so that she starts to like basically be at court as like his guest all the time. Like they become buddies. Like he essentially friend zoned her, and she was like, nah, that's fine. And then they just moved on with their lives. She gets out of it with land, with everything she could ever possibly want, and freedom. She never had to bang him. She never had to give him kids. She never had to do any of that. She didn't have to deal with the possibility of losing her head. She didn't have to deal with all of the drama. She would show up to the party and then nope out when she didn't want to be a part of it. And she had autonomy. And that's the thing. Anne had autonomy. And by the way, I'm not even looking down on marriage. I'm not looking down on being in relationships. I'm not saying anything against conventional marriage if that's what you want out of your life. And I'm not even suggesting that Anne would not have loved for that to have worked. But she got out of a Henry VIII marriage with most of her dignity intact. Like, he called her ugly, but she wasn't, first of all. And also, like, he was just whining and nobody listened to him at that point. She gets out of it with land and independence. She's told that aside from staying in England, she can kind of come and go as she pleases in terms of like court and what she does with her life and her time. And she just lives her life. She's allowed to have friends. She's allowed to have whatever she wants. And she becomes close with what would have been her stepchildren. She is close to Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth. Because she has religious fluidity in her background because of her family, she can kind of juggle the differences between Henry's offspring, because they fought constantly about who was legitimate and whose religion was better. You know, they did it back and forth the whole time, mostly because Henry caused that. But they didn't get along about a lot of those things, and yet somehow Anne of Cleves seems to be able to matriculate between all of them, and she gets along with them really well. She gives them gifts. She's part of their lives. February 15th of 1542 rolls around, and by that time Henry has already married the teenage Catherine Howard and then beheads her almost as fast. And she was only 19, by the way. That bastard. She was 19 years old. Loses her head to her marriage with Henry VIII. See, I'm telling you, Anne of Cleves got out like so lucky out of this bullshit, because he was obviously not done chopping heads off. Then in January 28th of 1547, Henry dies. So she's been in this whole like family at this point, like for 10 years. And she's been friends with Henry for most of that time. And she even attends both of his subsequent weddings. He got married to Catherine Howard. He then gets married to Catherine Parr after that. Anne of Cleves apparently said something along the lines of Catherine Parr was taking on a huge burden. Some people thought that it was her being like a little salty about him not taking her back. I don't think so. I think she saw him behead yet another wife and was like, you have fun. Like, I'm his friend and I love him, but like, I wouldn't be where you're at. So she does kind of make that comment, which I think is kind of funny because, you know, called out. But yeah, she's close to Henry for the rest of his life. He actually goes so far as to say that she is the most important woman in England, other than his current wife, whoever that would be at the moment, and his daughters. So like, she's considered one of the most important people in England as determined by the king. March of 1547, Edward VI, who is now the king in his father's stead, asks her to move from Bletchingley, which is where she usually lives, over to Penhurst, which was actually Henry's will that happened, just so she would have a place to live, and it was closer to Hever and all of her properties. And then in 1553, she actually attends Mary's coronation after Edward VI dies, and a couple of consorts and exchange power. Eventually, Mary comes into the fold. She takes over for her father, and at her coronation, her would-have-been stepmother, now basically cool auntie, attends in support of her. And then on July 16th of 1557, 10 years after Henry dies, Anne of Cleves herself does die at 42. The thing about Anne is that she was, to her dying day, a blue-collar queen in a lot of ways. Again, going back to how she was raised to be in the trenches with her servants. She was close to them. She enjoyed things like needlepoint, and she even enjoyed cooking. Once she started being really researched more heavily, historians have actually found receipts and bookkeeping from the servants' kitchens, And apparently all of these exotic ingredients would be brought in because she would experiment in the kitchens because she wanted to learn to cook cool stuff. So that like became like her little hobby. She goes about her life as a spinster, a very wealthy, very independent spinster, becomes best friends with her ex essentially, and lives out her life. She outlives all of Henry's wives. She outlives at least one of his children. And I genuinely believe that she was actually the lucky one. So yeah, she's a contender for this show, Crowned, Gilded, and Screwed, because obviously she was thrown into a bizarre situation and kind of screwed over at the beginning of it. But I do think that the fun twist on this one is that she actually comes out on top. I would argue that Anne of Cleves, who was considered the ugly, uneducated reject queen that everybody thought was uninteresting, I would argue she was actually the most interesting because she seems to have played Henry better than anybody else. She was also probably actually his friend after a while, but she knew how to handle him in ways that Cromwell couldn't, Wolsey couldn't, at the end Anne Boleyn couldn't. All of these people that are so well known to have been so big in his life that he would listen to and take advice from. And at the end of it, the one that kept her dignity and head intact was Anne of Cleves, which I think is pretty great. So it's an unusual one this time, right? It ends up on a high note. She lived her damn life, man. Independent, wealthy, just in her era. And I'm very happy for her because that was a dumb deal. Also, for the record, wasn't ugly. If you take a look at pictures of Anne of Cleves, like paintings that Holbein did, she looks normal. Like, she doesn't look like some crazy beauty. Like, Catherine of Aragon was a crazy beauty. And Anne Boleyn, while not necessarily considered a beauty for her time, was considered very sexy, very interesting, very exotic, and a lot of fun. She was very witty. While that might all be true, and maybe Anne wasn't quite what they were, she doesn't look like a hideous beast either. She looks like a normal girl. I'm gonna plug somebody else's channel. Hey, why not, right? Plenty of viewership to go around. One of my absolute favorite channels is a channel called Royalty Now, and they do a really cool, they do deep dives kind of like we do, but they do them with an emphasis on portraiture. And it's really cool because the narrator will actually go in and she will take portraits and cross-compare portraits of all of these people and then show you what they would look like in modern times and what they probably really looked like with more hyper-realism. And sometimes some of the later episodes, they even animate them a little bit. So it's pretty neat. And she does actually do one on Anne of Cleves, and she looks like a normal girl. She looks like a normal, kind of cute girl, actually. Honestly, I think Henry just built shit up in his brain and had the audacity to think that she was not in his league when she was definitely at the time out of the two of them the cuter one. Henry had that festering wound that again smelled, and he was just rapidly on the decline. So some of that is just like his ego not giving him a reality check, and some of it is also just he was let down by a number of things. I think his head wasn't in the right space, and again, his weird cosplay thing didn't work, and I don't know. I think he was slowly starting to not necessarily get it up and didn't want to admit it. I will say he never had any more heirs. Like, it stopped at Edward VI. So nocturnal emissions or not. Anyway, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Cara May Adamo. If you liked this show, please like and subscribe. We do appreciate it. It helps us keep going. Spread the word, tell your friends. Pull up a drink with me next time. We'll chat about another person and keep this thing going. If you want to find me on Facebook, my name is Cara May Adamo. I am the only one spelled the way that you'll see it on the screen. So I'm pretty easy to find. You can also find my personal TikTok is at Carita May. And we have a TikTok that will be shown up on the screen for Crowned, Gilded, and Screwed, the show. We also have an Instagram for Mayward Productions, which is our production company. A big shout out to our editor, Rosilio Hernandez, does an amazing job, and we appreciate him quite a bit. And thank you guys so much. We'll see you next time.